Have you ever walked around all day thinking you're looking cute, only to discover you definitely were not, but nobody said anything? One of those times that happened to me, I was in high school, 15 or 16 years old. My mom took me to get a haircut, but I didn't really know the styles that looked good on me. Some of you guys already know where this might be going. So when the stylist sat me down, I gave him these nebulous instructions of what I was thinking of and told him, whatever you think would look good on me. Mistake number one. What he ended up giving me, when it was all said and done, was the equivalent of the 1960s bubble flip hairdo, which, if you're not familiar, looks like this. Now, I get that this was probably all the rage at the time, and some ladies here today or watching us online might have rocked this hairdo back then, so I'm not saying it's a bad style. I'm just saying that for a teen girl growing up in the late 2000s, this was not it. But the thing is, the stylist told me, it looks so good, which of course he would say that so as not to lose a client. And my mom was like, oh, you look so cute, which of course she would say that because she lived through the 60s. And so I trusted their opinions and went to school the next day thinking that my new haircut was cute. Mistake number two. None of my friends at school said anything about my new hairstyle. That either meant they really didn't notice anything was different, which I doubt, because again, this style on a teen girl in the late 2000s is hard to miss. Or it meant that they actually didn't like it, but didn't want to say so, which I imagine was more likely the case. It was only until I ran across some reruns of the Brady Bunch or some other show from that area that I realized, wait a minute, that's my hair. And needless to say, I immediately styled my hair differently the next day at school. It would have been nice if someone had spoken up and spared me of the embarrassment. Maybe you've gone through something similar and you can probably empathize. But we may have also been on the other side of these kinds of situations when we chose not to say something to someone only to later wish we had. Like maybe to your friends who thought she looked cute with her dramatic makeup when really she was looking like a glamorous clown. Or to your brother who thought he was smooth talking to some girl when he unknowingly had a very verdant piece of broccoli in his teeth. But then they realized later when they looked back at pictures or they looked in the mirror and they come back to you saying, why didn't anybody tell me? And we might have sheepishly looked at the floor and said, I didn't want to embarrass you. Unfortunately, our good intentions didn't shield them from that embarrassment in the long run, now did it? We all have reasons for not using our God-given voice. Maybe we don't want to embarrass somebody by pointing out that their breath smells dank. Maybe we don't want to rock the boat and address that conflict at work. Or we may just straight up not even know what to say. So why unmute? Why speak up? Some of us may not even have the ability to use our God-given voice due to discrimination or fear of retribution if we did speak up. How can we say anything if we know that we're not going to be heard? Or how can we say anything if we know there's a high chance of losing our job or getting blasted on social media if we do? Sometimes it's just easier to stay silent, to stay on mute. But easier isn't always better for us or for the ones who really need someone to speak up. So what do we do when we can't or don't want to unmute, but know that staying silent comes at a cost? That tension is something that a woman in the Old Testament named Hannah can relate to. We first meet her in the first chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. She's the wife of a man named Elkanah, but not his only wife. He actually had two wives. One was called Hannah, a name meaning grace or gracious woman, and the other Peninnah, a name kind of probably meaning pearl. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. In the Old Testament, it was a common practice for men to have more than one wife. Whether it was a good idea or not is a whole other issue. But in this family's case, Hannah may have been Elkanah's first wife, but due to her infertility and the cultural importance of producing an heir to continue the family line, he probably took on Peninnah as a second wife to try to have kids. If you're familiar with the first few books of the Bible, their situation sounds a lot like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who each similarly had a beloved wife who was incapable of bearing children. But God worked a miracle for those women, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, each giving them a child despite their infertility. And not just any child, but a child of great significance to the history of Israel. So could it be that Hannah's story would end much like theirs? Each year, Elkanah would devoutly take his family to worship God in a town called Shiloh. It was the central place of Israelite worship before the temple in Jerusalem was built. That worship involved offering an animal sacrifice to the Lord as a symbolic act of worship. Now, an animal sacrifice might seem kind of morbid for us today, but for them it represented giving something valuable to God as an expression of gratitude. The type of sacrifice Elkanah offered was called the peace offering, which was really this joyful sacrifice where part of the meat was burned up for God, part was given to the priest, and part was given to the worshiper and their family to eat. It represented sharing a meal with God, which is a beautiful concept when you think about it. For us, we might pray for our food and thank God for providing it, but we don't typically picture ourselves as sharing our lunch with God. But in their culture, sharing a meal with someone was an act of intimate fellowship. So the symbol of sharing a meal with God through the peace offering was one of deep communion with him. Really beautiful, right? However, for Elkanah and his family, what was meant to be a joyous, worshipful occasion instead was marked by conflict. The story says whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival, Peninnah, kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. This whole family dynamic is complicated, to say the least. Not only do you have a guy who has more than one wife, which is bound to spark drama in and of itself, but he also has a favorite wife, just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, which unsurprisingly spurs rivalry. This man gives Peninnah and her kids their expected share of meat from the peace offering, but where Hannah was supposed to get only one, because she didn't have any kids, he gave her double, and not like in secret. He could have done it in secret and was like, shh, don't tell Peninnah, but publicly, showing the whole family how much he loved one wife over the other. On the one hand, his great love for Hannah is touching. In that world, we might expect he'd love Peninnah more because she was able to provide him with the children he was expected to produce. But the stigma of Hannah's infertility doesn't diminish her husband's love for her. He actually loves her more than the productive wife. Ironic, but sweet, stirring, and problematic because Peninnah doesn't take that favoritism sitting down. So every year when they would go to worship God at Shiloh, she proceeds to cruelly and relentlessly taunt Hannah's inability to have children, making her weep to the point where she refuses to partake in that joyful meal with God. Her weeping is technically the first time she uses her voice in the story, but notice that it's not to speak. Peninnah's unyielding bullying could have made Hannah shout in anger or respond with some choice words of her own or report it to her husband so he could intervene. But all Hannah could manage was just to weep. And I don't know about you, but I don't imagine her weeping was silent. When I'm in deep enough pain that I need not to cry, but to weep, I'm not just shedding a tear and quietly dabbing my eyes, hoping people don't notice. I'm groaning, crying out because words just aren't enough. And if all I can do, if that's all I can do, that's better than just staying silent, better than burying my feelings or withdrawing emotionally from people who care or self-medicating with things I probably shouldn't be self-medicating with. Weeping is a valuable use of our voice. In fact, research shows that emotional tears provide health benefits. They release endorphins that help ease physical and emotional pain. So if you're going through something painful today and you're not sure if you have any words, give yourself permission to just weep. That's still a valuable use of your voice. If you're not going through something painful today, but you know someone who is, give them permission to weep as well. Your voice might be the one that they need to no longer push down their emotions, but to process them when they might need to the most. Pro tip, if you do try to comfort someone who's in pain, don't do what Elkanah does. Watch this. So her husband, Elkanah, says to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" I don't know if these are rhetorical questions, but I kind of feel like if this is your favorite wife, you gotta have some idea of why she's weeping. Sure, she could be weeping for other reasons, so it doesn't hurt to ask, but you know the stigma of her infertility, it's not a secret to you. And if this is your favorite wife, Penina's bullying shouldn't be a secret either. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But then when he hits Hannah with the, "Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Listen. If I'm a woman living in a culture where my social clout rides solely on my ability to have kids, I love you, dear husband, and give me the 10 sons, okay? Don't get me wrong. I see his good-hearted intent and appreciate that he don't blame her for not being able to have kids. He's not pressuring her to keep trying. He's essentially saying that even if they never have kids together, he'll still love her. That kind of love is powerful in that social milieu. But that don't remove Hannah's pain from not being able to have a child. As much as her husband loves her, Elkanah kind of doesn't really understand. And when someone doesn't understand your pain, it can make you want to stay quiet. In previous messages I've given here at New Hope, you've probably heard me talk about my perpetual struggle with burnout. And I've been so appreciative of those who understand what that struggle is like. I also recognize if someone's never experienced burnout, it can be kind of hard to grasp. I might hear things like, "Okay, so you're burnt out because you have a lot of things on your plate. Why don't you just say no to some of them?" I wholeheartedly agree and advocate for setting proper boundaries and learning to say no so you can say yes to the things you need to say yes to. And those who've been burnt out might see that that's not always so simple. Saying no requires energy. It requires looking at your packed calendar and your mile-long to-do list and prioritizing them based off importance and urgency, which itself can be challenging to do. Then, if you're a people pleaser like me, you have to confront your inner people pleaser and convince her there's a difference between saying no to a request and saying no to a person, and hopefully the person will understand if you say no to their request, which granted is not a guarantee. Then you have to actually talk to each person that you have to say no to, take a little extra time with the ones who don't really understand why you're saying no, and then go back and finish your sermon while your 60-page thesis is put on pause because you have to say no to doing both at the same time to want to preserve your sanity. Then when the sermon's over, you got to figure out additional things you have to say no to for the rest of the month to make up for those 2 weeks of research time that you lost because of sermon prep. Saying no takes energy, all right? But what if someone is so burnt out, they don't even have the energy to get out of bed in the morning? Maybe just saying no is not as easy for the chronically burnt out as some people might think. So when I get this well-intentioned advice that kind of reveals the person doesn't really understand where I'm coming from, honestly, it can make me want to stay silent. I can appreciate the heart behind it, but like Elkanah's words of comfort, the advice isn't really helpful. So I tend to think to myself, they don't get it. There's no use explaining. Let me just nod politely and be on my way. And maybe you've experienced something similar. That strongly opinionated person at school or work doesn't get where I'm coming from, so let me just not say anything. Or my overly eager auntie never hears me out about why I prefer to be single, so I'm gonna keep to myself. It's easier to just stay quiet. But what if it's not necessarily better? Sure, there might be some people who may never get it. But what if others might, if we give them the chance? What if, rather than writing off someone who might give well-intentioned, unsolicited advice, I shared my experience of burnout with them instead? It could give them the opportunity to see where I'm coming from. Or what if, instead of meeting Elkanah's words of comfort with no response, Hannah let him know why those words were not very comforting? It could give him a chance to see from her perspective. Again, it's not a guarantee. The words can fall on deaf ears, or the person might assume they see things from your side when they really don't. But staying silent could ultimately end up hurting me as I avoid addressing that lack of understanding. And it could hurt them by allowing them to continue in that lack of understanding. What if speaking up can provide an opportunity for that understanding to finally happen? For Hannah, she's not going to keep things to herself for very long, though. She continues in the story, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now, Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servants, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. We finally hear Hannah speak, but it isn't in reply to her husband's well-intentioned but kind of insensitive comforts, or in response to Penina's bullying. Hannah first speaks in the story to pray to the Lord. And notice that this isn't some polite, perfunctory prayer. It's one of deep anguish. Her earlier weeping is now a bitter weeping. So she looks to divine intervention as her remedy. But God had actually already intervened in Hannah's case, just not in the way that she would have hoped. You might remember earlier in the story, verses 6 and 7, that the Lord had closed her womb. It actually says it twice in 2 consecutive verses. Can you imagine knowing for a fact that God is directly and actively preventing you from doing one of the most crucial things that determines your worth as a woman in that culture? That raises a lot of questions. Is this judgment for some sin in Hannah's life? Is this supposed to be a test of her faith? Why would God do something that he knows would lead to such pain in her life? They're questions that anyone who's ever experienced suffering and pondered the existence of God have asked. And they're questions that don't have easy answers. It's enough to shake the faith of many, to turn someone away from belief in God entirely. But the crazy thing is that Hannah turns to God anyway, even as she knows he's behind her childlessness. She prays to him anyway, pleading for him to look on her misery and show her that he hasn't forgotten her. She asks him to give her a son anyway, vowing that if he does, she'll give her son back to God and serve him all his life. She goes so far as to promise that no razor will touch her son's head, referring to the symbol of the Nazarites. Like Samson, if you know the story, the super strong guy in the book of Judges, Nazarites were men or women who consecrated themselves to God for a period of time, during which they couldn't cut their hair. That may have symbolized total dedication of their powers to God, or separation from the usual customs of life. Either way, Hannah's either really foolish to think that the God who deliberately closed her womb is just going to change his mind and give her a son after all, or she's really bold to think that the God who deliberately closed her womb is going to give her a son after all. She's either really reckless in vowing to give up the one thing she's asking God to give her that will theoretically solve all her problems, or she's really serious about a relationship with God that doesn't involve just taking, but also giving, just as she asks him to give to her. Her act of prayer and the contents of her prayer are full of paradoxes. Yet, what if paradox sometimes characterizes the act and contents of faith? When I was about to graduate college as a theology major, I got an invitation to pastor a church. However, I had no desire to be a pastor. I already had plans for my future. I was going to graduate with my bachelor's degree, go straight to seminary and get my master's and a PhD, and get right into teaching religion and higher education. Why derail all that to be a pastor? Like Hannah's prayer, the decision just kind of seemed foolish or reckless to me. I even tried convincing God in my prayers that this wasn't the move, but he was like, "That's cute, this is the move." And so that's how I became a pastor. For me, at the time, it made no sense to go in a direction I didn't want to go, especially if the direction I was planning seems like the right one for me. But as a person of faith who believes in a God whose thoughts and ways are higher than mine and who wants what's best for me, maybe it was the right call after all. Now, having been a pastor for a number of years, I can see why God shifted my plans. He's not only given me the privilege of walking alongside people on their spiritual journey, he's also grown me in mine. Sometimes taking a step of faith doesn't always make sense. It might look foolish, even reckless to some. But like Hannah, that step of faith may be all we have left. Don't get me wrong, we also need discretion and wisdom to make informed decisions. And we might find ourselves in situations where we have more questions than answers, where all we're left with is this invitation from God to trust him. Maybe you find yourself in such a situation where you lost your job or you're afraid you will soon and you don't know what comes next, where your best laid plans didn't work out and you're wondering why. Or like Hannah, where you might be in great personal pain and you're kind of wondering if God is behind it all and if it's even worth it to unmute and talk to him. It would be nice to have all the answers. It would be nice to get the result we want. But what if all we might have is this all-powerful God who challenges us to trust him? And maybe in the end, that'll be enough. Because taking that step of faith might not make sense, be ready for some people who might not get where you're coming from. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli, the high priest, who was sitting there, observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." Though her prayer was the first time in the story we heard Hannah speak, it wasn't out loud. She was speaking internally to God, as might be normal for many of us who pray to God today. But in that time and place, people normally prayed out loud. To pray silently was really odd. Couple that with the reality that drinking abuses were actually common in the religious festivals at Shiloh, and we can see why the high priest naturally thought Hannah was drunk. However, that doesn't excuse the reality that he misjudges her genuine spirituality, and Hannah's not about to let it slide. She's like, "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Don't take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Where before she couldn't find the words to respond to Penina's taunts or her husband's unhelpful comments, now that Hannah's used her God-given voice to speak to the Lord, she's ready to use that same voice to speak for herself. She respectfully corrects the high priest's false accusation, declaring that she hasn't been drinking, but pouring her soul out to God in her deep anguish. But notice that she's assertive, but humble, confident, but true to her name and being gracious. She could have lashed out, raised her voice, matched Eli's energy, and maybe we would not have blamed her if she had. But instead, the first time she verbally uses her God-given voice in the story is to speak for herself in a way that's assertive, humble, and vulnerable. That's a rare combination in today's world. If someone misjudges us, some of us might be inclined to use our voice to get aggressive, blast them on social media, pick a verbal fight. Others of us might be inclined not to use our voice, at least not directly to the person who misjudged us, and be avoidant instead. Just brush them aside, gossip about them behind their back. But to use our voice to be gracious and assertive is to use our God-given voice in a better way, correcting the wrong, but with a gentle tone, holding that person accountable, but in a civil way, addressing the tension in the room while de-escalating it. What if a humble voice can have more power than we think? For Hannah, her humble voice had the power of changing her story. Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. The tone in the narrative finally shifts. Eli, though unfortunately without an apology, nonetheless changes his tune, blessing Hannah's prayer with confidence that God will give her what she asked. And Hannah again responds graciously and departs triumphant. She had first approached God in the depths of despondency, but now she leaves the sanctuary elevated and transformed. Using her God-given voice to cry out to God and assertively express herself enables her to partake in that peace offering meal with some peace of her own. And it gets better. The story continues. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." What was once a seemingly foolish or reckless prayer is now a fruitful one. The once childless, ostracized woman now victoriously bears a son named Samuel, meaning asked of God. It turns out her story does end much like Abraham's wife Sarah, Isaac's wife Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Rachel. God blessing her with children of her own despite her infertility. But notice that for Hannah, it was in the course of time, meaning she didn't get pregnant immediately. Who knows how long she and Elkanah had to try, how long they had to wait, but everything happened in due time. God likewise responds to our voice in due time. A few months ago, I had the privilege of baptizing my oldest sister, Sheila, as she recommitted her life to Jesus. But for a while there, I didn't know if that was a decision she would have wanted to make. My sisters and I were raised in the church, but Ata Sheila later had challenging life experiences that compelled her to question her faith and eventually leave it entirely. For a number of years, she identified as someone who didn't believe in God. My family and I prayed for her for a long time. So long, in fact, that I honestly stopped praying about it. Maybe part of me didn't want her to feel forced to do something she didn't want to do. Maybe part of me stopped having hope. But then one day, she sent me a text saying she wanted to start doing Bible studies and get rebaptized. I was floored. I honestly never expected to get a text like that from her. And before I knew it, I had the honor of baptizing her. God responded to my family's collective voice in due time, even when I had given up using that voice. But God didn't forget. We might have had to wait many years, but that whole time he was working behind the scenes, making everything happen right when they needed to, until my sister became our Samuel, our asked of God. Maybe you're in a similar time of waiting. Maybe you've done your part to lift your God-given voice and pray that prayer, interview for that job, talk to that therapist, resolve that conflict, and now you're just waiting to see what happens. Maybe you've been waiting so long that you kind of have stopped hoping. Know that God will respond to your voice in due time. I don't know when. It could be after a few days or after many years. I don't know how. It could be by giving you exactly what you asked for or something totally unexpected. But I believe, just as for Hannah and just as for my sister, that even now God is working behind the scenes, making everything happen right when they need to. Who knows but that you will receive your asked of God, all in due time. Hannah's story is not over yet, but for the sake of us, I'm going to summarize how it ends. I do encourage you to go back and read 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2 for yourself. It's such a rich story. So God kept up his end of the deal, and Hannah commits to fulfill hers. After waiting till Samuel's weans, around 3 years old, she and Elkanah, who, by the way, incredibly agreed to her vow to give up their one and only son in service to the Lord, they take Samuel to the sanctuary along with this generous offering of thanks to God. And when they bring the boy to Eli, that high priest, Hannah declares, "Pardon me, Lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord." Hannah uses her God-given voice again, this time to testify to the once disbelieving priest about what God did for her years prior. Then in chapter 2, she prays this beautiful poetic and prophetic prayer, one of the longest recorded in the Old Testament. In it, she lifts her God-given voice again and praises him as this all-powerful reverser of human fortunes, who exalts the lowly and uplifts those devalued by others. But God's not done with her yet. Every year, the family made their annual trip to worship God at Shiloh, and they got to see Samuel and receive a blessing from Eli. Eli would bless them, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. I have this quote on my vision board. "Very soon you will smile and say, 'God, this is more than I prayed for.'" I bet Hannah could say that too. She didn't necessarily ask God for more kids after Samuel was born, but in his grace to the woman of grace, he provides her with 5 more children, more than she asked for. It's a total 180 from where we first met Hannah. The childless woman who was bullied by her rival now has the last laugh. The woman who didn't say much when the story first began is now a vocal, spiritual powerhouse. The woman who once barely found voice to do little more than weep now uses her voice to declare God changed everything. And it wasn't because of the high priest's intervention. It wasn't because of her husband's virility. It wasn't because of her position in society, but because of her posture before God. God can use a humble voice to triumph and transform. What if he can do the same for us? Maybe you find yourself similarly in a circumstance where it seems like there's no hope. Maybe you've done all you can and nothing seems to be working out. Maybe even those you most hope would be in your corner just aren't, or they don't get where you're coming from. It can be tempting to hit mute and act like everything's okay. It can be tempting to not say anything to others or to God and just withdraw. It can be tempting not to speak up when others misjudge us or aren't listening and just write them all off. But what if the cost of staying silent is too high, ultimately hurting us and those who want or need to hear from us? This week, I challenge each of us to look at one area in our lives where it can be easy to stay silent and to reflect on one way we can humbly use our God-given voices. Maybe that's just giving ourselves permission to weep, maybe even alongside someone we trust, instead of keeping it buried inside. Maybe that's crying out to God in our bitter anguish instead of believing that we just need to try harder. Maybe that's assertively yet graciously speaking up for ourselves instead of aggressing or avoiding those who don't get it. Whatever that step of faith looks like for you, it might not make sense to you or to others initially, but who knows if God can use even your humble voice to triumph over your circumstances and transform your future. And perhaps all it takes is hitting unmute. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, I'm so grateful for the voices you've given each one of us, however humble. And you know that there are times when maybe we might be tempted to stay silent, to keep to ourselves, to keep it all in, to not say anything. And I pray you'll forgive us for that tendency, but that you'll give us the courage to use our voices when we need to. I pray that, like Hannah, you'll help us to take whatever step of faith that might look like and know that you will respond to our voice in due time. We pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.